As a urologist with more than 10 years of experience, I'm going to tell you something that may genuinely surprise you. Women do not think about size in the way most men assume they do. In reality, much of what you've been told about what women supposedly want is simply inaccurate, and it's silently damaging men's confidence. What's even more unexpected is that there are clear reasons why obsessing over size alone can actually make the experience worse instead of better. And the third mistake is the point where most men unknowingly work against themselves. If you fail to understand this, you're approaching the entire thing the wrong way. So stay with me, because what I'm about to explain could completely change the way you look at this subject. You know, this is one of those topics that comes up much more often than people openly admit. Usually quietly, sometimes with anxiety, and very often shaped by misinformation. As a physician, I've seen how much pressure men place on a single number, almost as if it determines their value, their relationships, or even their masculinity. But once we actually examine the science, real evidence rather than internet myths, the discussion becomes far more grounded and honestly far more reassuring. Research consistently shows that relationship satisfaction is not determined by size alone. In fact, study after study highlights that most women place far greater importance on emotional connection, mutual respect, and communication than on physical measurements. Human anatomy also tells us something important. Sensitivity is not distributed in a way that rewards extremes, and comfort plays a major role in creating positive experiences. What many people overlook is compatibility. Every individual is different, and what matters most is how partners understand one another emotionally and physically. Confidence doesn't come from trying to meet some imagined ideal. It comes from awareness, respect, and the ability to communicate openly without insecurity or fear. There's also a deeper health aspect here. When men become fixated on unrealistic expectations, it can create anxiety, performance pressure, and even avoidance of meaningful relationships. That's not merely a social concern, it's a health concern. Shifting attention toward overall well-being, confidence, and connection leads to much healthier outcomes both mentally and physically. So if there's one important point to remember, it's this. Science does not support the myths. Genuine satisfaction is built through understanding, trust, and connection, not through a number. And once we begin to see it from that perspective, the conversation changes in a way that is not only more accurate, but much healthier for everyone involved. When we discuss what science actually says about size and satisfaction, the first thing that needs to be carefully corrected is the belief that there's some universal standard women are comparing men against, because there simply isn't. In clinical settings and research environments, what consistently appears is variation, not precision. Studies carried out across different populations repeatedly show that most women do not express a rigid preference for a particular measurement. Instead, they describe comfort, compatibility, and overall experience as being much more important. And that's a meaningful shift because it moves the discussion away from pressure and toward understanding. From an anatomical perspective, sensitivity is concentrated in certain areas rather than spread throughout the entire vaginal canal, meaning extreme size does not automatically translate into greater satisfaction. In some situations, larger size can actually create discomfort rather than pleasure, something that is rarely discussed openly but is well recognized within medical literature. What usually matters far more is how well partners respond to each other. Things like pacing, communication, and attentiveness often play a much larger role than people realize. There's also a psychological dimension that science makes very clear. Perception frequently matters more than measurement. When individuals feel emotionally safe, respected, and connected, their overall experience improves significantly. That emotional environment can shape physical satisfaction in ways that no single physical characteristic ever could. This is exactly why research often identifies relationship quality as a stronger predictor of satisfaction than any anatomical factor. Then there's the issue of misinformation. Many beliefs surrounding this subject are shaped by unrealistic media portrayals that create expectations completely disconnected from real-world data. When those expectations go unchallenged, they often lead to unnecessary anxiety and self-doubt. But when people are introduced to actual scientific findings, there's often a visible sense of relief because reality is far less extreme and much more human than they were led to believe. So once you start viewing this question through a scientific lens, it doesn't just change the answer, it changes the entire way the question itself is understood. And that's where things become truly interesting. When you move beyond the purely physical side of things, what becomes very clear both through research and real clinical discussions is just how much communication and comfort shape the entire experience. It's not something people always expect to hear, especially after being conditioned to believe everything depends on physical attributes. But when women are asked what genuinely contributes to satisfaction, they rarely begin with measurements. They talk about how they feel, whether they feel safe, and whether they can openly communicate their needs without hesitation. Comfort is not only physical, it's emotional as well. If someone feels nervous, judged, or uncertain, the body responds to that. There is a direct relationship between emotional state and physical experience. Science has repeatedly shown that trust and relaxation can strongly influence how the body responds. This means the exact same physical situation can feel completely different depending on the level of comfort and emotional connection between partners. It's subtle, but incredibly powerful. Communication plays an equally significant role, and not just in a general sense. It's the small, ongoing feedback, what feels good, what doesn't, what could improve, that gradually shapes a more satisfying experience. Many people assume things should naturally work without discussion. But in reality, the most fulfilling relationships are usually built on honest and open conversations. It removes guesswork and replaces it with understanding, which is far more effective. There's also something important about attentiveness. Being present, paying close attention to a partner's responses, and adjusting based on that awareness. These are qualities that consistently appear in studies about satisfaction. It's not about perfection, it's about responsiveness. That level of engagement often matters much more than any physical characteristic because it creates the feeling of being understood and valued. Interestingly, when communication and comfort are strong, concerns about physical insecurities often begin to fade into the background. People become less focused on comparison and more focused on the shared experience. That shift doesn't just improve satisfaction, it transforms the entire dynamic into something more natural, more connected, and far less pressured. And once you truly understand the influence that has, it starts to challenge many of the assumptions people previously believed were true. Another aspect that doesn't receive nearly enough attention is compatibility. Because in medicine, we don't evaluate individuals in isolation, we look at how things function together. And when it comes to intimacy, there is no one-size-fits-all model. Every person's anatomy differs slightly, not only in terms of size, but also structure, sensitivity, and even how the body changes over time. So when people obsess over a single measurement as though it determines everything, they miss the much bigger picture of how two people actually interact and fit together. From a clinical perspective, adaptability and comfort are far more meaningful indicators. The body is not static. It responds to emotional state, relaxation, and arousal. That means what works well for one person or one couple may not feel the same for another. Compatibility is really about how partners adjust to each other, how they find a rhythm together, how they respond to feedback, and how they create an experience that works specifically for them rather than according to some outside standard. There's also a major difference between expectation and reality. Many people carry assumptions about what should matter, usually shaped by things they've seen or heard rather than actual experience. But once those expectations meet real-life dynamics, they often begin to change. What once seemed critically important becomes less significant, while factors like comfort, connection, and mutual understanding start taking priority. Then there's the role of awareness. Being aware of a partner's verbal and nonverbal responses allows adjustments to happen in real time that improve the overall experience. It's not about getting everything perfect immediately. It's about being attentive and adaptable. That flexibility is what creates genuine compatibility, and it's something that develops gradually over time rather than being instantly determined. What's interesting is that once people begin understanding compatibility this way, it changes how they evaluate both themselves and their relationships. The focus moves away from comparison and shifts toward cooperation. It becomes less about matching some fixed ideal and more about discovering what works best between two individuals. And once that perspective settles in, it opens the door to a far more realistic and much less pressured understanding of intimacy. One of the biggest difficulties surrounding this subject is separating what people have been told from what scientific evidence actually demonstrates. There's a long history of myths shaping expectations, and many of those myths are repeated so frequently that they begin to sound like facts. But when you step into a research-based or clinical environment, those ideas simply don't hold up. What emerges instead is a far more nuanced and honestly much more reassuring reality. A large number of common beliefs come from exaggerated media portrayals where everything is designed to attract attention rather than reflect reality. Those portrayals create a very narrow definition of what is supposedly ideal. Over time, people internalize those standards without ever questioning where they originated. The problem is that these standards are not based on representative scientific data. They're built around performance and visual impact, not around genuine human experience or satisfaction. When researchers examine real populations, the results are much more balanced. Preferences vary significantly, and most people do not align with the extreme expectations that are commonly promoted. In fact, many studies show that emotional connection, consistency, and mutual understanding are considered more important than physical traits alone. That doesn't mean physical factors have no importance, but they represent only one piece of a much larger picture. There's also a tendency for myths to create completely unnecessary anxiety. When someone believes they're expected to meet a certain standard and they're uncertain whether they do, it often leads to overthinking and self-doubt. That mental pressure can actually interfere with performance and the overall experience, creating a cycle that reinforces the original fear. It's something that comes up regularly in medical discussions, and it demonstrates just how powerful perception can be. What's fascinating is how quickly perspectives often change once people are exposed to evidence-based information. When they realize the standards they've been worrying about are not actually supported by science, there's usually a noticeable shift in how they view themselves. The conversation becomes less about trying to live up to unrealistic benchmarks and more about understanding what truly contributes to a healthy and positive experience. And that's usually very different from what they expected when they first began asking the question. When the discussion finally moves away from numbers and comparisons, something much more meaningful starts to emerge: confidence. But not the kind built around proving something. A quieter, steadier form of confidence that comes from understanding your body, being present, and no longer constantly comparing yourself to unrealistic expectations. In clinical conversations, this is often where the real transformation takes place. Because once that pressure begins to disappear, many other things improve alongside it. A lot of men don't realize how closely physical response and mental state are connected. When there's constant self-evaluation or internal questioning like, "Am I enough?" it creates tension. And that tension doesn't stay confined to the mind, it appears physically as well. Stress can affect performance, concentration, and even the ability to enjoy the moment itself. But when someone feels genuinely more comfortable and confident, the body responds differently. Things begin to feel more natural, less forced, and more connected. There's also a broader health perspective that often goes unnoticed. Confidence built on unrealistic standards is fragile. It depends heavily on external comparison and validation, but confidence built on communication, self-awareness, and understanding is much more stable. It supports healthier relationships, reduces anxiety, and encourages a far healthier overall mindset. From a medical point of view, that kind of stability matters because physical health and mental well-being are deeply connected. Another important aspect is how people define being good in a relationship. It's not about reaching some fixed benchmark. It's about being respectful, attentive, and willing to learn. Those qualities don't come from physical traits. They come from mindset and behavior. And interestingly, those same qualities are consistently reported by partners as making the greatest difference over time. What often happens when someone adopts this healthier perspective is that comparison slowly loses its hold. Instead of asking, "How do I measure up?" the question becomes, "How do I connect more effectively?" That shift changes everything. It takes the focus away from performance and places it on experience, which is where real satisfaction actually exists. And once you truly begin to understand confidence through that lens, not as something you constantly prove, but as something built through understanding and connection, it changes the way you approach not only relationships, but overall health as well. It's no longer about chasing a standard that was never realistic in the first place, but about creating an experience that feels authentic, balanced, and genuinely aligned with what science has been showing all along.